Alrighty guys, hope you guys are doing well. Professor Kirk here, back with another video for you all. Today we're going over cardiorespiratory responses to acute exercise. Keep in mind these videos just cover the main topics and ideas that you need to know for the course. If you have any questions, ask your professor or your graduate student. So with that said, let's get into it. So exercise, right? Exercise, begin. Okay, so once you start exercising, what are some of the things that happen? Well, one of the main things is that you have an increase in heart rate, which is expected because as we get into later, your body needs more oxygen, and an increase in heart rate kind of helps with this aspect. But other than an increase in heart rate, we also have an increase in stroke volume. So Professor Kirk, what is stroke volume? So stroke volume is the difference between the end diastolic volume and the end systolic volume. End diastolic volume is the volume that is within the ventricles when it is being filled with blood before an ejection or before a contraction takes place. And systolic volume is the amount or the quantity of blood within the ventricles or within the chambers that is residual after a contraction has taken place. All right, so that's what systolic volume is. Then what we have is something called Q, aka cardiac output. And the cardiac output, the equation for this is just heart rate times stroke volume equals cardiac output. All you need to know about that. Then we have blood pressure. Blood pressure, as you obviously know, is the force exerted on your arteries and various vessels throughout your body. One way that they really measure this is through something called mean arterial pressure. Just keep that in mind. That'll come up again. All right, so typical resting heart rate is between 60 and 80 beats per minute in untrained individuals. People who are well trained, such as like advanced athletes, it doesn't have to be necessarily a marathon runner, be like in basketball players, soccer players, etc. Their heart rates can be anywhere from 30 to 40 beats per minute. That just means that the heart has developed a really high efficiency of pumping blood, and as a result, it doesn't need to labor as hard, so it doesn't need to beat 60 to 80 times a minute. During exercise, whether it's in untrained or trained athletes, there's something called a steady state heart rate, and this occurs when you're exercising. Like originally, when you first start exercising, you're breathing super hard, you have labored breathing. Well, your body needs to catch up. And once it does catch up, there's a plateau. If I had a graph to show you all, like when you first start exercising, your heart rate's going up, 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 up. And then once you get to a point where your heart rate has caught up to the metabolic needs of your body, it kind of plateaus. And it does that until the exercise is over. What's it called? Oh, and this occurs for optimal circulatory needs. This is AKA cardiac output. Your cardiac output needs to adapt to the exercise intensity that you're having. One thing that it describes this is the Fickle principle, which calculates how much O2 is consumed by the exercising tissues. And this is not an equation that you'll need to memorize. This is just something that's used to calculate how much oxygen that your specific tissues need in order to maintain effectively throughout the course of the exercise. And then over here we have something called max heart rate. So this is a kind of an outdated equation, but it is something that you'll see. Max heart rate looks at, well, it's more of an estimation of how high a person's heart rate should go when exercising. And that's just 220 minus your age. My max heart rate is 197. From that, you can calculate my age. All right. Okay, moving on. Sympathetic vasoconstriction. What is this? So when you're exercising, there are certain things in your body that don't need blood as much as your exercising tissue. For example, let's say if I'm exercising really hard, right? My stomach may not need as much blood as, let's say, my bicep if I'm doing a bicep curl. Why? Because my bicep is going to need more oxygen so the tissue can function more effectively to complete the exercise. My stomach is not really going to need all the excess blood. So what happens with these sympathetic vasoconstriction, sympathetic meaning from the autonomic nervous system, that's the fight or flight type responses that we talked about earlier in the course. We're looking at increases in heart rate and all this stuff up here, right? So that's sympathetic. And then vasoconstriction is just the constriction of the blood vessel. So less blood flow is going to a certain area. And it shunts blood away from the less active regions, such as liver, pancreas, etc. Things that aren't necessarily being tapped into as much as your muscles when you're exercising. Now, this redistribution only occurs during an exercising or a flight or fight response, as mentioned earlier. Okay, so we go on to something else that you need to know for this chapter is the concept of cardiovascular drift. So what is cardiovascular drift, Professor Kirk? All right, so let's say you're outside. Let's say you're a football player and you got on all these pads and stuff like that, and it's hot. Like it's really, really hot outside. What will happen is that as you exercise, your body will heat up, and it'll need to cool off by sweating and stuff and such as that, right? But the environment is still hot. Like it's still 98, 100 degrees outside. So what happens with cardiovascular drift is that your cardiac output will still be high, your heart rate will still be high, but your stroke volume will kind of be low. And this is exaggerated. You have a better graph in your PowerPoints and in your book and such. But this is definitely exaggerated. But what happens is this stroke volume, it becomes lower, or it decreases, merely due to the fact that a lot of the blood that usually would be diverted to exercising tissue is being diverted to the skin. And this is because blood carries heat, and when you're exercising, you don't want to overheat. So a lot of that heat that is within the blood will be carried to the skin so that you can sweat and that heat can be released. So your stroke volume as a result will decrease due to this. And also, if you keep exercising in this high heat or this hot environment for however long, more than like 2 hours, 3 hours, I mean, it really depends on your intensity. But let's say if you were out there for a very long time, your heart rate can also tail off if you continue to exercise with this super high intensity. That's why you see football players all the time who are like, hey, stay hydrated, drink your water, type of thing. Because if you don't, it can become very problematic. There have been people who have died like on the football field before just from overheating. And that's why it's very much important to, I guess, kind of honor this concept of cardiovascular drift, especially if you're like a football coach or even if you're just a student athlete. All right. Now progressing on downward, what we got next is we're looking at plasma volume, which kind of goes into changes in cardiovascular response as well, but it's mainly plasma volume. So the first point of plasma volume is that as you sweat, your plasma volume goes down. Plasma has liquid in it, specifically water. As you sweat, that water gets relieved from your system, from your blood specifically. So your volume is going to go down. The next thing is with this plasma volume, how this kind of interacts with, or how this happens is through these things called Starling forces. Now these Starling forces occur through these two forces in particular. You have one called hydrostatic pressure, another one called oncotic pressure. So hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that is exerted on the blood vessel walls when the blood is passing through. It's passing through here, right? And as a result, when the blood passes through these arteries, it'll push water into the interstitial spaces. Now you have something in there, you have these proteins. I wish I had a marker to show you. But you have like these proteins all in here, these big globular proteins called, I think, I forget what they are called, but I know they contribute to the oncotic pressure. And they do this by, they create a sucking type mechanism that pulls excess water that has been pushed out by this hydrostatic pressure back into the vessels, right? So what you need to know is hydrostatic pressure pushes out, oncotic pressure sucks in, right? Now this can decreases in fluid allows for greater concentration of red blood cells. And that makes sense because if we're having less water within the blood, that means we're going to have a higher concentration of just red blood cells. Now, mind you, people think blood is just red blood cells. No, the blood, you have amino acids, you have small proteins, you have red blood cells, you have white blood cells, you have all types of things within the blood. But specifically, when this fluid leaves, we have a greater concentration of just, red blood cells. And this is important because red blood cells have this protein called hemoglobin, which is what is responsible for carrying the oxygen, right? So if we have more blood cells, that means we have a higher concentration of hemoglobin, and more hemoglobin can carry more oxygen. So this is good as a result of sweating, and that's exactly what happens in the body. And if we have more oxygen, that oxygen can be carried more efficiently to our exercising tissues and such. All right, last point for this section is changes in cardiovascular response. So if we're looking at the hypothalamus, we're looking at it from for a neurological standpoint. Your hypothalamus is like the integrative sensory center of pretty much everything, right? So when you start exercising, the hypothalamus receives info from the brain and muscles and the muscle receptors. Like in the muscles, you have these things called mechanoreceptors, you have chemoreceptors, and you have baroreceptors. You have all these receptors that feed into the muscle that give information about what to do. Now, once that muscle gets the information, it then transfers it over to the hypothalamus to make a decision in regards to what needs to happen. And the hypothalamus was like, all right, we need to breathe more, or we need to activate the autonomic nervous system. We need more adrenaline. And that's exactly what happens with this hypothalamus input. And it does this through the afferent neurons, which are the ones that go away from the body, and they actually send the signal to, hey, this is what's happening on the outside world. So that's what you really want to know about the hypothalamus. It just receives input from everybody about what to do, and it makes a decision from there. Now the last section we're going to talk about is ventilation. So ventilation, You want to know that it increases based on need. If you're exercising really hard, you're going to have more oxygen. You have a greater cycling of oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout your body. If you're not working out as hard, you'll have a lesser cycling of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You have this thing called dyspnea, which is just a fancy word for shortness of breath. After you run, you see those track runners and those soccer stars about, we fought really hard, you know what I'm saying? They're just out of breath. And that's really all dyspnea is. It's nothing complicated. It's literally just a shortness of breath. Hyperventilation on the opposite side is a little bit different than dyspnea. Now, it's not necessarily, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, okay, hyperventilation and dyspnea are polar opposites. It's not necessarily. The opposite of hyperventilation would be hypoventilation. But we're not going to get into hypoventilation. You really just want to know about hyperventilation. With hyperventilation, what this is a faster and deeper breathing cycle within the individual. So what happens with hyperventilation is that, moreover, when you're taking deeper and faster breaths, you develop a high oxygen content, but you'll have a low carbon dioxide content. So some people are like, oh, well, I mean, you may be thinking that, oh, CO2, less CO2, that's not a bad thing. Not necessarily, because then you can run into problems. You can run into things, whether it be acidosis or alkalosis, alkalosis is higher, that your systems become too basic, which can affect the overall metabolism of your body, or they become too acidic, you know what I'm saying, which is acidosis, which can also affect the metabolism of your body. So you want to make sure that you keep those two in balance, and ventilation does that for you. You don't have to think about this. So none of this is something that you have to be consciously thinking about. All this happens through that integration of the hypothalamus and its interplay with the autonomic nervous system. All right, so moving on to the next few points. We have the Valsalva maneuver, which is what you'll hear about a lot. A lot of weightlifters, when you see them working out, they're like, type of thing, right? What they're doing, and the reason why they're doing that is, first off, it's automatic. Very few people, especially those who aren't trained, don't concentrate like, let me suck in all this air and build all this intra-abdominal pressure. They're not thinking about that, but your body does that as a form to compensate for, I guess, how should I say it? Okay, let me back up. Your body does this essentially to help you develop or achieve a certain rigidity so that you can carry whatever weight that you're carrying. So for example, if I'm doing squats, right, and I'm taking that deep breath, my core gets tight, my posture is more cohesive as a unit, and therefore I'm less susceptible to injury, and I'm also able to move the weight more effectively in regards to Newton's third law, which is for every reaction there's an equal and opposite reaction. You can do some research on that. You don't need to know that for this class, but that's essentially the principle lying behind this. So with that Valsalva maneuver, the only problem is that if you hold it for too long, you can pass out because you're holding in all that breath. You're not breathing. Your muscles aren't getting oxygen, aren't getting the oxygen that they need. So it can be problematic, and it can definitely cause for serious cardiovascular complications if not performed correctly. So just be cautious whenever you're performing this in your weightlifting classes and such. We already talked about acid-base balance. That's with oxygen and CO2 and stuff like that. It can cause huge metabolic problems if you're cycling oxygen too quickly, or if you're breathing in oxygen too slowly. Like, that's essentially the main concept that you'll want to understand from that. And last but not least, we have the poisoning. This is something that you're not really going to run into that often. You have carbon monoxide poisoning, ozone poisoning, which is just 3 oxygens bound together, sulfur dioxide poisoning, and all these things are just kind of mess up the respiratory system and overall your ventilation rate in general. And that's the main thing. Like, these things can bind to the oxygen that you're breathing in and cause bigger problems to where you can't even get oxygen to your tissues at all. That's pretty much all that you want to know for that aspect of the ventilation section. If you have any questions though, feel free to email me. I hope this video was helpful.